I don't know whether I've proven my point or not, but I take this as a win. It's about as good as it gets when you're dealing with UC. But a further point is that UC actually hides what it does with tuition. It hides where tuition goes, and it hides this even in the way that it distributes tuition campus by campus. It talks about rising costs, but what it's willing to pay on each campus is widely varied. Widely varied. I looked, I haven't published this yet for various reasons, but I've looked at the funds generated by student enrollments from the state and from tuition on each UC campus in comparison to the funds returned by UC's policies to those campuses. The last available year, UC generated $22,000 per student combined from tuition and state funds, $15,000 from the state, $7,000 from tuition that year. And to return these funds to the campuses, UC might have simply returned $22,000 to the campuses. In fact, the return to the campuses is extremely unequal. How unequal? Merced gets $13,000 per student. In other words, less than its equal share of state funds, even if there were no tuition. UCLA gets $30,000. 6 UC campuses, including this one and mine, Santa Cruz, get $13,000 less per student than UCLA out of funds that every student generates on an equal basis. In other words, 6 UC campuses do not get, after tuition, much more than what their state funds would be if they got an equal share of state funds and there were no tuition. At Irvine, if there were a fair distribution of state funds, could get by with tuition at its 1992 level, if that too were fairly distributed. This is an illustration of the fact that they do whatever they want. This is an illustration of the fact that we need to be making demands against UC, not just demands for more funding for UC. We need to demand that they change these things. The maldistribution that is the result of UC's own internal funding policy resulted in disparities to the campuses of over $13,000 between the top funded and the bottom funded campuses, which is twice as much as the amount that the state cut in budget. In other words, for 6 campuses, the financial problems are twice as much UC's fault as they are the state's fault. This is another reason why we must demand change from UC in return for more state funding. And when I talk to people in state government, what is most shocking to them is that the $13,000 in per student funding disparities between UC campuses, between Irvine and UCLA, is much greater than the disparity in funding intended under the master plan between the UC system as a whole and the CSU system as a whole. We're talking about reconsidering or revisiting the master plan. Nobody knows, because UC has never revealed these figures, that the policies that UC chooses to create and chooses to conceal have essentially undone the master plan. Now that tuition is $11,000, the chancellors are going to have to distribute it more equally. So guess what? The chancellors at the richer campuses have simply now proposed that they be allowed to charge higher tuition, which they can keep, in order to completely avoid the question of whether they should each first give back the $7,000 in differential tuition that they're getting. No one has asked UC to fix this problem. I confronted the financial vice president on the Pat Morrison show with 3 regions. They completely admitted it. I understand that OP has now actually produced studies that replicate the facts in my study. I have this on confidential but valid authority. We must make UC promise to fix these things. And if they won't make such a promise, we must go to Sacramento to demand that they do so and to march against them. Otherwise, they will never change. Now, to do this, we need to move from the question of price to the question of principle. We need to state a coherent public reason why UC should be funded by all taxpayers in California, rather than by squeezing eligible students and their families to borrow more, to pay higher tuition that moves the median student higher on the debt equity frontier. This is the fundamental question. The fundamental question. And it's not a question that Californians are used to asking. Why? Because UC used to be free. UC used to be free at a time when no one doubted that it was a public good that is both cultural and economic. And at a time when California was, at least in the upper half of the income band, one of the most economically equal states. Now, however, people talk entirely about the private good of education. And what do they mean by private good? They mean being on the upward side of an income gap that is growing and that UC wants taxpayers to believe is partly an effect of higher education, as it was at least during the 1990s, when the data on which this theory was based were collected. Since 1978, when UC was free, almost all income growth in California between 78 and 98 was earned by the top 20%. The bottom 80% were left behind. And since the 90s, UC became aware of this data, and therefore it sought to add tuition. Why? Because as expected income inequality grows, people should be more uncertain about where they will be, and the more uncertain they are, the more anxious they are, and the more anxious they are, they will want to borrow. If you're a policy wonk, in other words, you could view UC tuition as a partial proxy for income insurance. Suppose you could, for example, simply financialize, this is I'm a policy wonk, financialize or securitize some gap between income inequality and income growth, aggregate income growth, and protect yourself against the effect, the idea that as economic growth occurs, income will become more unequal. If you could do this directly, you wouldn't need higher education, and UC wouldn't be able to reap that money in tuition. But it's a matter of public policy that they'll let you do this on credit if you spend the money on UC. That's the deal. That's the deal. Because UC is a partial proxy for this. And so higher education is a factor in income inequality, but the idea is that growing income gaps essentially result in what can be described as simply growing dispersions of incomes, which can be described in terms of some of the stuff I study on options theory, growing volatility. And so essentially tuition is a way of reaping in the form of a price these effects. So in other words, from this perspective, when UC was free, it was simply that then we had relatively uniform income in the top 50%, high income equality, steady growth from which all equally benefited. It was free because we were one of the most equal states, and we now need to charge tuition because we are one of the least equal states. And it's a circular argument, and you are all being asked to buy it because you have been given no coherent reason for thinking of UC as an engine of equality in California rather than a driver of inequality. No coherent reason. And that's why polls such as the Pickett poll say two interesting things. They say that people are unwilling to pay for higher education. Why? Because they view higher education as the poster child of a tax subsidy for the rich, which the rich should pay for by themselves.